welcome to our morality chapter 5, lesson 2. This lesson is going to be on what's called the SEER method, S-E-E-R. And our main objective for this lesson is to introduce the SEER method and then to be able to apply it later on to the film How to Train Your Dragon 2. So we watched How to Train Your Dragon 1 during Sacraments, and now we're going to watch How to Train Your Dragon 2, and you're going to need to be able to apply the SEER method to the film. So let's get started. For our warm-up for Lesson 2, it's called Classwork 2 5.22, Crisis of Conscience in The Force Awakens. And if you go to Schoology, there's a link to a Lego reenactment of the scene where they attack the village in The Force Awakens, and Finn is has this crisis of conscience. So, and I'll show you where this is on Schoology. It says, watch this Lego reenactment of Finn's crisis of conscience. Finn has been raised to become a stormtrooper, but when the time comes for him to act, he resists. What's going on here? If he was formed to be a bad guy, why does he resist? Use what you are learning about the natural moral law and conscience to explain. So this was a class discussion where we didn't necessarily turn anything in, but we discussed it as a class. So if you're absent, you'll just be excused. Make sure you're excused from this. But I want to show you where it is just for your own reference. So if you go, it's you'll see it right here, 5.22, Crisis of Conscience. So what we did was we watched, there you see the link. We watched the little Lego movie in class, and then we discussed this as a large group. So what you'll see in the film is even though Finn was raised in an environment where he was taught to be a bad guy, because he has a conscience, the conscience is crying out to him and telling him not to do what he deep down knows is wrong, despite what he's been trained to do. So the conscience is sort of putting some tension in the film. So that was our warm-up, and now let's go to the SEER method. So the SEER method is whoops, that's not an S. Hang on, let me fix that. It's S-E-E-R. So this isn't sear like you sear a steak. This is seer as in someone who's a wise individual. A seer was a wise person, sometimes even someone who could see the future. In the you usually hear this word in the Bible or in the ancient world, but this is a method that we can use to specifically employ the conscience. So you'll remember previously we learned the STOP method, S-T-O-P, for moral decision making. SEER is specifically related to the conscience. So let's go over it now. So we define the conscience as a judgment of the intellect. So again, the conscience isn't merely the capacity to have a sense of right and wrong. That would be synderesis. Rather, conscience employs that sort of innate ability to want to gravitate toward the good and avoid evil, and it uses that to make a judgment using reason about what to do. So it's not acting on feelings or preferences. So the conscience should be, again, using the intellect. The opposite would be doing what an emotion says to do. Emotions or our passion. Those can very often mislead us, right? Or preferences. We don't want to be doing only what we prefer, because sometimes we can have a bias. And we don't want to be biased. We want to do what's right. So the first step in the SEER method, the S, is, so the S here is study. And for this part of the SEER method, you're basically going to go through the STOP method once more. So gather all the information. So that would be the S, right? What is the S was search out the facts. So search out the facts, and that's the moral object. What is the action? The intent. What is the motive? And then also the circumstances. Who, what, when, where. So you have to find that out. Then you have to, the T was to think about alternatives and consequences. The O was to consider others, both consult them and then consider how your actions will impact them. And the P was to pray. Always bring God into the mix. So you have to do that whole STOP method just to figure out what your options are. Then review the fundamental principles of morality. So what are my objective moral standards? The golden rule, the categorical imperative, which is never use anyone as a means to an end, and never do something evil to achieve a good. Those are both always wrong. And then the love commandment. Love one another as I have loved you, Jesus says. And then remember, we had the O was consult others. Always consult someone else. Ask someone else's opinion. That's so that we don't act on a bias or a prejudice. So sometimes, teachers will, when we're worried about perhaps there's a student we're afraid we might have a bias, we'll ask another teacher. We'll take the student's name off and say, hey, can you grade this, look at this? Do you think this grade is fair? Because we don't want to have a bias. I actually had a teacher do that with one of my papers in high school. When I found out she'd done it, I was a little bit upset because I didn't want the other teacher, because she'd given me a low grade, and I didn't want the other teacher to think poorly of me. She had left my name on the paper, and I was upset by it, but normally you wouldn't leave the student's name on the paper. So this is all for the step study. Basically, the idea is to gather all the information, know what the rules, the principal rules are, and know the lay of the land. Now, obviously, most decisions we do habitually. A lot of times we don't even think about them, so we act by habit. Conscience does become sort of habitual. It is a habit, and that's why virtue and vice, virtue and vice are so important. We want to be practicing the virtues and not habituating vices. So that's the first step in the method. Let's go to the next one. So the first E in SEER is elect. So once you know the lay of the land, you need to choose the right course of action. And for this, prayer can be very important because sometimes it's super hard to choose to do the right thing. So slow down, listen for God, speaking through our intellect. So remember, we want to do what's rational. We want to use reason, not going off on emotion, not acting on fear or something like that. Let God clear you, calm you down so you can use reason. Your imagination, again, imagine all the consequences, the possibilities, and your memory. When have you been in a situation like this before? Bringing in God into our inner self, have Him help you access these deeper regions of the self in order to make a good decision. And then pray for the fortitude to follow your conscience. Again, your conscience is going to judge. It's going to make the judgment. Are you going to act on your conscience or not? Are you going to, you have to choose, elect, what should I do? So maybe you have 3 choices. Usually there's usually more than one option. There's usually not just 2. So you let your conscience be your guide. Let it make the judgment, but you gotta choose which option are you going to take, 1, 2, or 3. And once you've made that election, the next step is execute. So you have to make a decision, and then you have to execute. You have to take the step your conscience says is right. And this is something about Catholic morality that's kind of interesting. You have to do what your conscience says no matter what, even if your conscience turns out to be wrong. To violate one's conscience is considered a sin. In Catholic moral teaching, if you remember back from when we looked at conscience in the Catechism, conscience is considered sacrosanct. So the study part of SEER is really important because you want to have a well-formed conscience, but you always have to go with what your conscience says is right, not your gut, not your emotions, the judgment of your intellect through your conscience. So be an actor, not a reactor. What they mean by that is an actor is someone who makes his own decisions, who knows what he wants, who does what's right, who acts on his conscience, not just someone who reacts to everybody else. We can all think of times where we did things just because we were reacting to someone else. You don't want to be a reactor, be an actor. And this is the hardest part. Because again, remember, deep down inside, when we define conscience, that's where you're alone with God. And you can, lie to everyone else, even yourself, but you can't lie to God. You know what's right, and now it's time to execute and to do it. Finally, SEER, the R is review. This is a step that we so often today don't do. After an action, we should examine our conscience to see if we acted rightly. So if you're in a situation where, perhaps it was under duress, maybe someone was pressuring you to give answers to a test, and you were really struggling with what to do, and maybe you just acted, you reacted and didn't really act, go back, review. Did I do the right thing? And this is, again, in our society, so often we just act and act and act. We're always reacting, and we're not actually, thinking about what we're doing. We should take time to review. That's what we call the examination of conscience. So, at night when you pray, think about what you've done. Are you proud of your day? Did you do the right thing? Would you do something differently? Ask yourself these questions. There's a great quote in your book. There's no pillow so soft as a clear conscience. Because ultimately, if your conscience isn't clear, it's going to eat you up. And then if you find out, whoa, I made the wrong decision, repent and reform. Remember, God is always there to forgive us. That's what our next chapter is going to be about. Sin and forgiveness, the two sides of the coin. Repent, go to God in prayer, go to confession, and then reform. Now, we make mistakes, but we got to learn from those mistakes and not make the same mistakes over and over again. Because if we learn, we'll be starting to master the virtues, but if not, our actions will become habitual vices. So that is the SEER method. And what we're going to be doing this chapter is after lesson 3, we're just going to have a short, frequently asked questions on conscience. We're going to apply this SEER method to How to Train Your Dragon 2 and see how the characters either employ their consciences well or poorly in the film. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks.